A poor man was mocked and humiliated by his rich former classmates for being a cleaner, not knowing someone powerful was silently watching. What happened next left the whole company in shock. Paul Ajayi had everything: a rich father, a powerful surname, and a white Range Rover with personalized plates, the kind of life many only saw in movies, until one day everything changed. It was a morning that made people thank God for being alive. The sun kissed the white marble floors of the Ajayi mansion on Banana Island, where the Lagos lagoon shimmered like a sea of diamonds. Paul leaned against his balcony railing in a white linen shirt, sipping freshly pressed juice, his smile unbothered while a team of domestic staff buzzed below. Inside, a chef perfected seafood okra for Madame Grace while a driver waited by a polished Range Rover. Everything was perfect until Paul's phone buzzed with the first sign of the coming storm. If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family, and tell us where you're watching from in the comment section. Paul Ajayi lived in a world where the sun seemed to shine exclusively for him. From his third-floor balcony on Banana Island, the Lagos lagoon shimmered like a sea of diamonds, reflecting a life of effortless grace. He leaned against the marble railing, dressed in white linen that felt as light as his responsibilities, sipping freshly pressed juice while the salt breeze ruffled his hair. Below him, the mansion hummed with the silent, efficient energy of a dozen domestic staff. The chef was already perfecting a special seafood okra, the rich aroma wafting upward, while a driver polished the white Range Rover that bore Paul's personalized plates. Inside, the heart of his world sat reclined on a cream couch. Anna Ajayi, known to the high society of Lagos as Madame Grace, was the picture of eternal elegance. Even in her mourning robe, her manicured fingers curled around a china teacup with the poise of a queen. "You're glowing this morning, Mom," Paul remarked, walking past her with a playful grin. Anna raised an eyebrow, her eyes twinkling with the confidence of a woman who had never known want. "I always glow,
glowing,
darling,"
Mommy.
she replied with a soft laugh.
I'm always glowing,
"Poverty
darling.
has never met me."
Poverty never
The
met
laughter
me.
was still hanging in the air when the security alarm shattered the peace of the morning. The heavy iron gates of the estate were forced open as black Hilux vans roared into the driveway. Paul rushed to the foyer, his heart hammering against his ribs, only to find the house surrounded by armed EFCC agents in uniform. Neighbors began to gather at their fences, whispering and filming the fall of the house of Ajayi. "What is going on?" Paul barked, but his voice was drowned out by the flat, cold tone of an officer declaring a search warrant. His father, Gabriel, had been arrested for a 3.6 billion naira fraud. In 30 minutes, their laptops were seized, their files ransacked, and the golden silence of Banana Island was replaced by the terrifying, rhythmic wail of sirens. The crash of the house of Ajayi was not a slow crumble, but a sudden, violent explosion. Within 48 hours of the EFCC raid, the silence in the mansion became deafening. Gabriel Ajayi, a man who once commanded respect with a single nod, was now just a number in a cold cell,
This is a setup by
accused
my
of a
close
3.6
friends.
billion naira fraud he swore was a setup by his closest partners. Paul spent his days pacing the hollowed-out living room, watching the news ticker scroll his father's shame across the screen. The staff, the chef, the driver, the housekeepers, had vanished like smoke, leaving the golden boy and his mother to haunt their own home. Then came the phone call that ended the world. A flat, clinical voice delivered the news. Gabriel Ajayi was dead, a heart attack claiming him in the solitude of prison just 5 days before his potential acquittal. Paul's scream of agony echoed off the marble walls, but it was nothing compared to the sound of his mother collapsing in the kitchen. Anna, the woman who always glowed, was found twisted on the floor, her speech slurred into a terrifying mush. A stroke had stolen half her body, leaving her a prisoner in her own skin. The final blow landed a week later in the form of an eviction notice. There was no time for mourning. As Paul carried his paralyzed, weeping mother out of the mansion, the gates opened to a swarm of cameras and jeering reporters. The neighbors, who once begged for invitations to their parties, now hissed and filmed the spectacle on their phones. A yellow Kiki Napep waited at the curb, a jagged contrast to the white Range Rover that had once been their chariot. With nothing but the clothes on their backs and a few tattered memories, they fled Banana Island, disappearing into the gray, flooded heat of the Ajij slums. The transition from the marbled floors of Banana Island to the cracked cement of Ajij felt like falling from a cloud and hitting the jagged teeth of a gutter. The one-room apartment was a suffocating box that smelled of stale rain, damp wood, and the pungent aroma of a neighbor's fermented locust beans. Above them, the rusted zinc roof sang a chaotic metallic song every time the Lego sky opened up, forcing Paul to move his mother's thin foam from one corner to another to escape the brown drips of water. Anna, the woman once known as Madame Grace, lay on that foam with a stillness that broke Paul's heart daily. She was a queen in a dungeon, her designer wrappers replaced by faded cotton, her eloquent voice reduced to slurred, frustrated whispers. Paul would sit on the floor beside her, staring at the stack of certificates he had brought back from London, thick, cream-colored papers with gold seals that promised a future of boardrooms and mergers. Now, they were just expensive scraps of paper. Every time an HR manager saw the name Ajayi and remembered the headlines of the 3.6 billion naira fraud, the door was slammed shut. His degrees were worthless in a city that only saw him as the son of a disgraced man. Hunger was a constant visitor, but it was the sight of his mother's empty pill bottles that finally crushed his pride. By the second week, her tremors had returned, and her eyes held a glazed look of pain she tried to hide. Desperation drove him to the gates of Prime Trust Company. When the HR woman offered him a faded blue jumpsuit and a mop for 40,000 naira a month, Paul didn't flinch. He didn't tell her about his honors degree or his father's legacy. He simply reached out and took the bucket, his hands trembling not from shame, but from the terrifying realization that this mop was the only thing keeping his mother alive. He was no longer a prince. He was a son with a mission. The fluorescent lights of the Prime Trust Company office hummed with a clinical indifference that mirrored Paul's new reality. Clad in a faded, oversized blue uniform that smelled faintly of bleach, he moved with the mechanical precision of someone trying to become invisible. He was bent over a workstation, scrubbing a stubborn coffee stain from the carpet, when the heavy glass doors swung open, bringing with them a wave of expensive cologne and the sharp rhythmic clicking of Italian leather. "Wait, is this some kind of hidden camera prank?" a voice boomed, cutting through the quiet office chatter like a blade. Paul froze. He knew that voice. It belonged to Latif, a man who had once begged for an invite to Paul's birthday yacht parties in London. Paul stood up slowly, clutching his damp cloth as he faced the trio. Latif, Folu, and Davidson stood there, draped in silk ties and arrogance, staring at him as if he were a specimen in a jar. "Oh my God, the Banana Island prince is mopping floors," Davidson barked, his laughter drawing the attention of the entire floor. Folu stepped forward, his eyes narrowed in a cruel, mocking squint. "I heard your father died in a cage for money laundering, Paul. I guess the soft life really turned into hard labor, didn't it?" Paul's ears rang, and he bit his tongue until the metallic taste of blood filled his mouth, but he simply bowed his head. "Good afternoon, sirs," he whispered, his dignity a thin shield against their venom. The mockery intensified as Latif deliberately stepped into a puddle of dirty water and then planted his muddy sole onto a clean chair. "Hey, Janitor Paul, I need these wiped," Latif sneered, pointing at his shoes. "Don't use that filthy mop. Use a tissue and make sure you get the soles. We don't want this place looking like your father's prison cell." As Paul knelt to clean the shoes of the men who used to envy him, he remained unaware that from the shadows of a corner office, the silent eyes of CEO Garuba were recording every humiliating second. Paul's existence had become a grueling cycle of silence and survival. By day, he was the invisible ghost in a blue jumpsuit at Prime Trust, scrubbing away the coffee stains and arrogance left behind by Latif and the others. By night, the transition was seamless but exhausting. He would shed his damp uniform in the shadows of the Ajij slum and climb into a borrowed, dented sedan to navigate the chaotic arteries of Lagos. The double life wasn't a choice. It was a desperate math equation where every fare meant another blister pack of blood pressure medication or a bag of rice for his mother. Behind the wheel, he was just a nameless driver to the wealthy elite he once called peers, his London degrees tucked away like a shameful secret while he chased commissions into the early hours of the morning. One humid Tuesday, the weight of the double shift felt heavier than usual. His back ached from mopping the executive wing, and his eyes burned from the glare of oncoming high beams during a 4-hour stint in traffic. As he approached their cramped one-room apartment, a cold dread prickled his skin. The door was slightly ajar. Paul dropped his keys, the metal clattering against the concrete as he burst inside. "Mom!" he called out, his voice cracking with a fear he usually kept buried. He found Anna Ajayi, the woman once known as the radiant Madame Grace, sprawled on the cold, damp floor near the bathroom. Her wheelchair stood empty and mocking against the wall. She had tried to reach her medication, but the bottle lay upturned, white pills scattered like pearls across the dirty linoleum. Her eyes were open but vacant, her breathing shallow as she shivered in the dark. Paul gathered her frail, paralyzed frame into his arms, sitting on the floor and rocking her gently. In the suffocating silence of the slum, the true desperation of his situation laid bare. He was working himself to death, yet he was still failing the one person he was doing it all for. The following Monday, the air in the Prime Trust building felt heavier than usual. Paul had just finished scrubbing the executive wing's floors when his supervisor approached with a grim expression, instructing him to report to the CEO's office immediately. Paul's heart hammered against his ribs. He was certain that Lateef or Davidson had finally fabricated a reason to have him fired. He wiped his damp hands on his faded uniform, adjusted his posture, and knocked on the heavy mahogany door. Inside, Garuba sat behind a vast desk, his gold-rimmed glasses catching the morning light. For a long moment, the CEO said nothing, his unreadable gaze fixed on Paul. "I have been watching you, Paul Ajayi," Garuba finally spoke, his voice a low, resonant hum. Paul braced for the blow, but it never came. Instead, Garuba continued, noting how Paul arrived 30 minutes before the other cleaners and stayed long after the corridors had emptied. "I have also seen the way my staff treats you," Garuba added, his eyes narrowing slightly as he referenced the mockery and the coffee spills he had witnessed from the shadows of the cafeteria. Paul lowered his eyes, his throat tightening with the effort to remain composed. He expected pity, but Garuba offered something far more valuable, a test. "My driver just quit," the CEO stated, leaning forward. "I need someone I can trust, someone who knows how to bleed without showing the wound. Can you take the role?" Paul was stunned, the mop bucket world he had inhabited for months suddenly tilting on its axis. He stammered a breathless "Yes, sir," and as Garuba handed him a new ID card for the personal staff, the crushing weight of humiliation finally began to lift. For the first time since his father's death, Paul felt the flicker of his own dignity returning, shielded by the silent protection of a man who saw his worth beneath the blue jumpsuit. For 3 agonizing days, the CEO's luxury SUV sat idle, while Garuba's frustration transformed into a cold, gnawing worry. Paul had never been late, yet now his phone was a dead end and his seat was empty. Driven by a gut instinct he couldn't name, Garuba secured Paul's residential address and navigated his own vehicle away from the manicured streets of the island, descending into the chaotic heart of the Ajij slum. The air grew thick with the smell of open gutters and charcoal smoke as he parked amongst zinc-roofed shanties, feeling like an alien in a world of desperate survival. He spotted Paul emerging from a cramped provision store, looking haggard in a faded t-shirt, clutching a sachet of water and a small cup of soaked Gary. When their eyes met, Paul nearly dropped his meager meal, his face a mask of panic and shame. "Sir, what are you doing here?" he stammered. Garuba didn't waste time on pleasantries, demandingly asking why his best driver had vanished without a word. The truth spilled out in a broken rush, a bathroom fall, a hospital emergency, and a stolen transformer cable that had left them in literal and figurative darkness for months. "Is she inside?" Garuba asked, his voice softening. Despite Paul's hesitation about the state of their one-room parlor, Garuba pushed forward, stepping through a narrow alleyway into a space that barely fit a bed and a wheelchair. There, bathed in the dim light of the window, sat Anna. She was thinner, her face etched with the weariness of a stroke survivor, but her eyes remained unmistakable. As she turned her head, the air in the room seemed to vanish. "Emma," she whispered, using a name Garuba hadn't heard in decades. Garuba froze, the high-powered CEO suddenly replaced by the ghost of a heartbroken university student. "Sandra," he breathed, stepping toward his first love, the woman who had disappeared into a life of wealth with another man, only to be found broken in a slum 20 years later. In that cramped, sweltering room, the past collided violently with the present, and Paul realized that the man who owned his company was the same man who had once owned his mother's heart. The sun rising over the island felt different this time. It was no longer a reminder of a stolen life, but the dawn of a hard-won restoration. Paul stood in the center of their new duplex, watching the light dance across cream-colored walls and polished tiles that mirrored the hope returning to his mother's eyes. For Anna, the nightmare of the Ajij slum was finally over. As Garuba's team moved their few belongings into the spacious rooms, Paul felt the weight of the last few months, the smell of the gutters and the sting of the mop, begin to lift, replaced by the quiet hum of an air conditioner and the scent of a fresh start. However, the true restoration took place within the glass walls of Prime Trust Company. Paul arrived not in a faded blue uniform, but in a sharp charcoal suit that commanded the room before he even spoke. The announcement of his promotion to general manager moved through the office like a shockwave. In the conference room, the atmosphere turned ice-cold the moment Paul walked in. Latif, Folu, and Davidson sat frozen, their faces pale as they looked up at the man they had once drenched in dirty water for sport. The silence was heavy with the memory of every coffee spill and every janitor Paul slur. Latif, unable to look his new superior in the eye, submitted his resignation by noon, choosing the shame of the village over the shadow of his victim. Folu and Davidson remained, trembling as they tried to offer hollow pleasantries and cups of coffee to the man they had once treated like trash. Paul looked at them, not with the anger they expected, but with a chilling, quiet clarity. He didn't need to fire them to win. Seeing them shrink under the weight of his new authority was enough. He was no longer the broken orphan they had mocked. He was the general manager, and his presence alone was their greatest punishment. The sun filtered through the canopy of a lush garden on the island, casting golden patterns across a white aisle carpeted with rose petals. It was a day that felt less like a wedding and more like a coronation of hope. Paul stood at the front, adjusting the lapels of his sharp tuxedo. He looked out at the guests, seeing the faces of those who had stayed and the empty spaces left by those who had fled. He caught the eyes of Folu and Davidson, who sat awkwardly in the back rows, their heads bowed in a respect born of both fear and realization. They were no longer looking at a janitor, but at the man who held their careers in his hands. A hush fell over the garden as the strings of a violinist began to swell. Then, the miracle happened. The doors of the villa opened, and Anna Ajayi emerged. She wasn't in a wheelchair. Holding firmly but proudly onto Paul's arm, she took her first step, then another. Each movement was slow and deliberate, a silent victory over the stroke and the slum that had tried to bury her. Dressed in a cream gown that shimmered like the Lagos Lagoon, she looked every bit the Madame Grace the world had once known, but with a new tempered strength. Garuba stood at the altar in a navy suit, his eyes unashamedly wet as he watched his first love walk toward him after 20 years of silence. When Paul handed her over, their fingers brushed, a silent baton pass of protection. During his toast, Paul's voice carried over the garden with a calm that commanded the room. "I once thought my name was a curse and my life was over," he said, looking from his mother to the man who had seen his worth in a mop bucket. "But I wasn't just restored, I was transformed." As the new couple shared their first dance under the stars, Paul watched from the shadows of the trees, a small, unbothered smile finally returning to his face. The prince had returned, but the man he had become was far greater.